Thank you, Emma, and thank you all for joining us tonight for the talk Wildfire, A Tale of Two Backcountries with Dr. Megan Jennings. It's a very timely topic and something we should all know a lot more about. As Emma said, I'm Judy Gradwell, President and CEO of the San Diego Natural History Museum, and although our building in Balboa Park remains closed for the time being, our work to bring natural history to our community has not ceased. This week, we finally, briefly, had a taste of some fall weather, and our blog has a story about how local plants and animals change in the fall, and I suggest anybody who's interested take a look at that. We've also hosted some excellent talks recently that are available online. One of the museum's own paleontologists, Dr. Ashley Poost, gave an informal lunchtime lecture last Friday called Before There Were Cats. And if you'd like to dig into carnivores and their teeth, be sure to visit our Facebook page to watch the recording. And also, please keep an eye out for more of these lunchtime pop-up talks, which all take place live on our Facebook. The next of our evening Nat Talks is called Love of Land, and in it, Michael Connolly Mixwish will discuss traditional Kumeyaay practices and their relationship to the land. This talk takes place November 18th, and you can get tickets at our website starting next week. Of course, none of these activities could take place without your support. The tickets you purchased tonight, your donations, and your Facebook shares all help our mission thrive during this time, and we thank you. On to tonight's talk. The 2019-2020 season of Nat Talks is made possible by presenting sponsor, the Downing Family Foundation, and media partner KPBS, the public media station serving San Diego and Imperial counties. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Megan Jennings. Megan is a conservation ecologist and co-director of San Diego State University's Institute for Ecological Monitoring and Management. Her research generally focuses on informing conservation and management planning, and specifically incorporating landscape dynamics into connectivity planning. She worked for over a decade as a wildlife biologist for the U.S. Forest Service in San Diego, where her years of experience in land management informed her perspective as a researcher. Megan strives to work at the interface of science and management, developing applied research to address management and conservation issues, and communicating results and real-world recommendations to decision makers and managers. And I understand she's put together a retrospective talk tonight, which will be a real treat. So with that, let's welcome Megan Jennings.
Thank you for that introduction. And yes, this will be a little bit of a ride through my experiences in my career. And let's see here. And as you'll see, I created a bit of an expanded talk title here, because what I'm going to talk a lot about is not just wildfire, but biodiversity and wildfire in San Diego. And it might seem like when I talk about being a wildlife biologist, it might seem like, what does that have to do with wildfire? But as you'll see, different pieces and times in my career have actually continually brought these elements together and really made me so curious about how one affects the other and how they interrelate. And what a perfect place to be working in San Diego County, where we have such broad biodiversity. We are a biodiversity hotspot, but we also face frequent fire. And that's one of the things I've been exploring over the last close to 2 decades that I've been here in San Diego County. So, as Judy mentioned, I'm a wildlife biologist by training. That is my passion. That is how I came to be working in ecology. It's how I came to this work from the get-go. And you'll see there's quite a few mammals on this picture here. That's a lot of what I focus on, at least in my early research. And a lot of the positions that I took throughout my career was focused on studying mammals, study wildlife movement. As Judy mentioned, I've been very interested in landscape connectivity, and mammals are often good indicators, especially larger mammals like carnivores, indicators of that connectivity. So we can look at their movement behaviors, and we can understand how they navigate our landscapes and how we can improve those conditions through conservation actions to make sure that those populations and those communities of species are protected. So you might think, what does wildlife have to do with wildfire? Well, when I first came to California, I worked for this really fascinating study called the Fire and Fire Surrogate study. And that was my first introduction to fire. I had been working on different projects since I had graduated from college, working with white-tailed deer and a variety of other species. But this position sounded really interesting. And one of the key things that drew me in was it was about wildfire and wildlife. So the Fire and Fire Surrogate study was this study across a network of sites, as you'll see in this map here, across the United States to really get a sense for how could we start to address this problem that we knew existed, the fact that we had not had enough fire in our forests, they were not necessarily healthy, and we needed to do something to rectify that. And fire is one way, but also fire surrogates. So in other words, are there mechanical treatments that we could do that might replicate fire? And in addition to just asking the question about how that might change fuel loads or vegetation composition, this study was, I think, really amazing in the interdisciplinary nature of it. They were looking at wildlife, plant composition, fuels, entomology, soils, pathology, just such a wide range of things. And I think perhaps looking back on it, this inspired me to think big. How can we put all these pieces together in these interrelated systems to really understand the impacts of wildfire, the impacts of dynamic systems, the impacts of ecological changes on the different areas of interest, and then put that together into something that helps us figure out how to take action. But I was just a seasonal employee. I was doing nest searching, doing point calls for birds, doing small mammal trapping, lots of fun stuff out in the field. I did this work in the Sierra Nevada at Blodgett Forest, which is a forest that's managed by UC Berkeley. And I met some folks who introduced me to other folks at UC Berkeley. And that took me back to my love of mammals and carnivores. And I went to Lassen Volcanic National Park. And I worked on these really cool critters, the Sierra Nevada red fox, a rare subspecies of red fox that exists at high elevations, a very limited population, but we were following them around the Lassen area. They've since been found in more areas, so that's really exciting. And just had an opportunity to explore a different part of California. And so I wasn't really working on anything related to fire, but I hung around long enough that fire came up again. So I started doing work with their biology program. I was working for a researcher when I was doing the fox work, but then the park's natural resource program wanted to be doing some surveys prior to burning for noxious weeds, as well as the California spotted owl. We worry a lot about conducting burns or forest health activities in a way that might disturb owls, in particular nesting spotted owls. And so we would go out, hike all night long through the park, calling for owls, because we had several prescribed burns that were planned. And so we wanted to go survey for those. So I was tangentially related to fire, but because what I was doing, I was termed a fire biotech. So a biological technician really focused on things related to fire. And because that was my position, I was also trained to be a firefighter. I was trained to participate in a fuels crew where I learned firefighting techniques. I learned about prescribed fire. I learned about prescribed natural fire. I was able to participate in going out with what's called a fire use module. If you've heard the term prescribed natural fire or let burn, it's where a fire naturally ignites, maybe through lightning, and we let them burn. And so I had to have the cool experience of watching that and taking notes and seeing if we were meeting management actions. And this photo is from the photo in the upper left. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is from working on that fuels crew to conduct an actual prescribed burn. To do a lot of prep. I learned about collecting information that gets you to the point where you can actually do the burning, testing fuels, seeing how dry they are, the different components of the entire fuel composition of an area. And then finally, on a very chilly number of evenings, right around this time, many years ago, we lit that burn unit off, and I got to see what it was like to actually participate in a prescribed fire that was focused on restoring forest health in the Southern Cascades in the northern part of California. But again, that job didn't last forever. I was a seasonal employee, and I had the opportunity to apply and was selected to become a wildlife biologist on the Cleveland National Forest. And so I came down to San Diego and learned a whole lot of new things. I showed up in San Diego in June 2003, and I think you all may recall, or hopefully many of you recall, what happened in October of 2003, right about this time, 17 years ago. the Cedar Fire ignited, and it ripped through. It was unlike anything I knew from learning about fire over the past few years prior to coming to San Diego. It was a whole new experience. I was busy working from the very beginning, working on the fire. Oops, excuse me. I was trying to move my window so I don't have to see myself. There we go. I was learning a lot about a type of fire that I wasn't familiar with yet. And in fact, oops, hold on a second. Here, I got my windows all screwed up. There we go. So during the fire, I worked as a resource advisor, which is a job where you help advise, are there any fire suppression activities that might impact our natural resources that we might want to adjust if we can, given that life and protection of life and property are the priority. I worked on suppression rehab. In other words, where we had built dozer lines and built a hand line to protect communities. After the fire is over, we try to restore those to their prior condition. We try to undo those marks on the landscape. I participated in a post-fire burn area assessment, restoration protection measures. We conducted monitoring. I mean, this took over my life as a resource specialist and a biologist for the forest for actually the better part of at least a year. And it really shaped the way that I thought about this new system that I had been introduced to. And previously was this dense stand of chaparral and was now this burned, what appeared to be a moonscape. And what I learned a lot about is the difference between a wind-dominated fire and a fuel-dominated fire. So when I was working in Northern California, I was working in, I got my animations screwed up here. Okay, well, we'll just leave it like this. I was working in a fuel-dominated system. And so those are typically forests, as compared to here in San Diego, we often have wind-dominated fires. So that occurs in our shrubs and grasslands. It's our Santa Ana winds that really drive those fires. It doesn't so much matter how much fuel has accumulated. It can be not very much at all, as we saw in 2007, when we had fires show up in areas that had already burned in 2003, and we only had 4 years of vegetation growth. So we know that wind can really carry almost regardless of how much fuel there is. That wind-dominated fire is common in Southern California. With the fuel-dominated systems, we've really seen the impacts of fire suppression and forest management. You might be thinking about fires that are going on right now. And some of the ones that are fuel-dominated are fires like the Creek Fire that had that massive plume because it was consuming so much biomass, so many trees, dead and down material, just a lot there available to burn. Other fires like the North Complex or the August Complex that has now broken the state record. At the time Cedar Fire held the record. Like, this is not a competition you want to be in, but we were #1 for a while, and now we were down to #8 because a number of fires, almost every year we were breaking records. We've broken numerous records this year, with the August Complex burning over 1 million acres. That's 4 times the size of the Cedar Fire. And if you were around during that time, I remember going out into the field that Sunday. The fire started on Saturday, and I remember going out into the field and hearing over the radio, it had crossed the 15 and the 52 and the 8. And I was thinking, all of those places are very far apart. How can it have crossed all of them at once? And it was because that fire was just so massive for us. And if you think about being 4 times larger than that, it's fairly astounding. And some of the wind-dominated fires we've seen recently, just this week alone, we had the Silverado Fire and the Blue Ridge Fire, all fanned by those strong winds that were burning in Orange County this week. But earlier this month, or earlier this year, we had the Bobcat Fire, the El Dorado Fire, and here right in San Diego County, we had the Valley Fire. And we were really worried about how big that fire was going to get with the Santa Ana winds that were predicted. Now, there are some ecological, and I will say that these wind-dominated fires, one of the other issues is that because the fuel is not so much of a component, it's very much up to ignitions. If we have a fire ignite, it's going to take off. And so managing those ignitions is really the key issue. The ecological impacts of these are somewhat different. And for wind-dominated fires, one thing that we're concerned about is vegetation type conversion. What I mean is, if you have fire that occurs too frequently, which if something can burn anytime because you just need the right amount of wind, you can burn too frequently. And for example, that 2003 to 2007 interval, that was 4 years for something that usually takes 30 to 50 to 100 years to recover. In contrast, in fuel-dominated systems, we often see stand replacing crown fire. And that just changes the entire landscape. And that can take over 100 years to recover if you lose an entire stand, an entire forest. Interestingly, the Cedar Fire actually had both. We had both a wind-dominated fire and a fuel-dominated fire. And this is what that looked like. So in the early part of the fire, when it took off on that Saturday evening, it was under heavy winds, and it blew out to the west and to the south, and it burned this whole area in orange. But then several days into the fire, the Santa Anas let off and the onshore flow came back. And what we saw was that the fire turned around, and all of a sudden it was in our montane regions. It was in Laguna Mountain. It was burning up Cuyamaca Rancho State Park. It was in Julian. And that's when it was turned into a fuel dominated. No longer had that Santa Ana wind behind it, but it was consuming all the heavy fuel that we had in that forested environment. In particular, it was spurred on by the fact that we had fairly severe drought and a lot of tree die off prior to that time. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So this was just such a striking thing for me. It started spurring a lot of questions about what really happens when the landscape burns, because this is a picture looking down the San Diego River Gorge, River Valley. And this is what it looked like before. And then all of a sudden it became this, and it just looks so different. This is looking from the west side of the River Gorge across to the east. And it's such a major change in the landscape. I wasn't used to such large scale fires and such a complete change in what the landscape looked at. But I think the really great thing that happened was it created an opportunity. A lot of researchers jumped into action and took the opportunity at this massive natural experiment to study what the impacts of fires were on many of the species that make up our rich biodiversity in the region. So doing research on the impacts of the fire on the composition of reptiles and amphibian community, looking at the bird community. The NAT's own staff, Phil Unit, who's part of the bird and mammal department, he had just been finishing up the San Diego Bird Atlas and took the opportunity to revisit a number of those sites and look at how the composition had changed after fire. I remember running into Phil on a road out in the backcountry, and he was thrilled that he had just seen a green-tailed towhee and that he was seeing lazuli buntings, different species that we don't always run into when an area is unburned. And I think that just highlights that from our perspective as humans, fire really seems catastrophic. But it's not always. Ecologically, it doesn't have to be. What's really catastrophic for us is too frequent fire in our shrublands. It's that change. If we have so much fire that the system can't recover, that's really the problem that we're concerned about. When we have fires that are at a healthy interval, at a more natural interval that gives the landscape a chance to recover, we can see such cool things like fire following plants that we see no other time, cool poppies and a lot of other species. Deer come out anxious to have fresh browse, the fresh green up that happens after the fire. We see things like kangaroo rats that are excited to have an open landscape to run through and fresh vegetation growing. And that actually gave me an opportunity to work with some additional NAT staff. So Scott Tremar, also in the Department of Birds and Mammals, was working with a group that had gotten some funding from a joint fire science program, some colleagues at San Diego State, and was working with the Conservation Biology Institute. And they actually were doing a post-fire small mammal study, and they also did a carnivore study. My friend and former grad school colleague, Paul Schutte, was doing the carnivore work, looking at how carnivore community changed after fire. I was able to help do some small mammal trapping to look at how the community changed. And, we saw some really interesting changes where in areas that hadn't burned, you see species that really need that mature chaparral, like California mouse, maybe the pocket mouse, in comparison to a whole lot more kangaroo rats or deer mice when in the burned areas. And in particular, saw things like wood rats get hit really hard immediately, but they were able to recolonize. And so I was encouraged by this and inspired by this research, but I had more questions because a lot of the research was focusing on questions of how the community had changed. These different communities of species, of taxonomic groups had changed. And I was really interested I was interested in how they had changed, but I was also interested in how not just the community was changing, but how individual behaviors were affected, how that movement, right? It's back to my questions of connectivity and how animals use the landscape. I was really interested in how that might change their use of the landscape, not just in, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but on a much longer timescale. What happens when the area continues to burn? Which species do we see that may colonize quickly, may not colonize so quickly, that skirt the edge? I was really interested in some of those movement behaviors, and I returned to grad school to ask some of these questions, and I was fortunate to have colleagues that were watching many of these things happen and collecting data on species for other research questions who happened to have fires come by, and there was an opportunity to use some of those data for my graduate research. And you'll see in this series, this was the Santiago Fire, part of the 2007 firestorm, and I'll draw your attention to this lower left-hand corner. You'll watch the timestamp and you'll see some interesting things. So this is up in Orange County. There's a coyote hanging out in a riparian area, and he doesn't want anything to do with the camera, so turns around and goes in the opposite direction. And here we are on October 22nd at 4:50 a.m. And by 9 o'clock, here comes the Santiago Fire. It's amazing that this camera survived, but that coyote was there not that long before. And very quickly after the fire comes, as is very common in wind-driven fires, it's over. It's burned everything, and it's all that's left is smoke and ash. And here we are at 10:22 on October 22nd at 9:09 a.m. And just a few days later, here's a coyote. I don't know if it's the same one, but it just goes to show that they're still using these areas. They may not disappear for a very long time, especially these larger, really mobile species that I've been so interested in for a lot of my career. But it's this type of thing that has drove some of the questions that I was interested in asking. And in particular, I think one of the questions is, how do these animals respond to this dynamic environment in such a constrained place? So it's not just that they have to contend with fire, but they're dealing with fire in a place that's highly urbanized. And many of these species are avoiding the urbanization. They move around to avoid human activity and avoid interacting with people. And so that was really what drove a lot of my dissertation research. And I'll show you a few quick things that resulted out of that. But I was really fortunate to use a bunch of movement data to really understand movement behaviors and home ranges, and how species were responding to this burn landscape, not just in that short time period, but in much longer time period. And so these were some of the results that I had out of my dissertation research. So I was able to focus on mountain lions for one aspect, and I created what I was calling a preference index. So along the bottom here, you'll see each of these is an individual animal, because they all do very different things. I mean, this is really kind of the astounding thing. They're all doing very different things, in part because of where they are, but it may also be things that they're able to take advantage of, resources that they have, skills that they've learned from a parent teaching them to hunt different types of prey species. But what you see here is anything below the line indicates a sort of an avoidance of burned areas, whereas anything above the line indicates a sort of preference for the burned area. And what you'll see is in that initial time period, in the first year after the fire, most of the cats are more or less avoiding the area. But then come about 2 to 5 years after, you see a bit of selection going on where more of the animals are hanging out. Well, when you start thinking about a carnivore, what is it that they eat? Well, it's those deer. They like the deer. Deer like the fresh browse that comes up after a fire. And so it's likely that this is a response in part to what their prey species is doing. And then when you get out to about 6 to 15 years post-fire, which is what I sort of think of as the landscape starting to recover, you've got a decent amount of cover, vegetation cover, there's good places to hide, things start to return to normal, although clearly you've got two individuals doing something altogether different, but just one interesting way to look at it. And we did the same thing with bobcat, and we saw a very different signal. And it was so cool to connect this back to that small mammal research I had helped participate in, that the NAT had been a part of. And what we see here is a much stronger avoidance, and for a longer period of time. It's 1 to 3 years is the red in this case. And there's a much stronger avoidance of the burned areas, except for a few individuals, really avoiding that the first few years of fire. And then there's a little bit of preference, a little bit of avoidance. It's after that, after 6 years, it just seems to sort of peter out, and it just seems to be them going about using the landscape as they had before. Well, if you think about what bobcats eat in comparison to mountain lions, they're eating a lot of those species that get hit very hard in the fire. They eat rabbits, squirrels, a lot of smaller mammals. And if those small mammals don't have burrows to hide in, they're often caught up in the fire front and they don't survive. And so that means it takes a while for that prey base to recover. One thing that I was thinking about, so as I mentioned, we have this issue or this concern about vegetation type conversion in our region. And that was one question that I wanted to add on to this piece of what are the long-term ramifications on individuals and individual movements and behaviors. I wanted to think more about fire return interval departure. So when I say fire return interval, it's really just what is the period between fires. And in chaparral, we think it's somewhere between 15, 30, 50, upwards of 100 years. It depends really on the exact type of chaparral and the vegetation components of the community, but it's variable, but it's not a short turnaround. It takes a while to come back. But what happens if those fires are more frequent? Like I pointed out earlier, that 4-year interval, what does that do? Well, one example is this area in orange and red here. This is the San Diego River. And you'll notice that it's in orange and red. And that's 34 to 66% more frequent or 67 to 99% more frequent. So that just means if the average time is 30 years, we're that much more frequent. We're a third to 2/3 to 100% more frequent. And what that indicates is that there's potential for type conversion. There's potential to shift from what was traditionally or historically a shrubland environment to something that's more grassland. Our non-native annual grasses come in, they invade, and they change the whole landscape. And so I was also interested in asking some questions about how that affects species and their movement, because it's not just the immediate effect of the fire, but what happens to a bobcat that tends to avoid burned areas in the first few years because their prey base disappears. What happens if we're constantly in that early successional state, if we're having fire after fire and the whole system changes? And some of you may know that when we shift to a grassland dominated system, it turns into a feedback loop. So fires become more and more frequent because that grass is lighter, flashier fuel. It's easier to ignite and it's easier for fire to spread. Now it burns more quickly, but the consequence has already occurred, and it can really, again, just enhance that whole cycle of making fires more and more frequent. And so overall, I've been kind of interested in what this does to that biodiversity in our region. We know, for example, the Hermes copper butterfly here at the top is a species that we've seen some extirpation of local populations because of fires. We haven't necessarily seen recolonization of those areas. And it could in part, some of it's just the fire itself, but it could in part be that the vegetation community doesn't come back. They need host plants, the spiny redberry. They need nectaring plants like buckwheat, and those don't always come back when you've burned too frequently. We know, for example, the cactus wren. They need cactus to nest in, and those aren't always coming back after fire, especially when you're having repeated fire. And there's been some efforts to do cactus restoration. The California gnatcatcher, our iconic San Diego species that has driven a lot of our conservation action. In the San Diego River, we've lost a number of nesting sites because of frequent fire. Those areas are constantly in a state of change, and the vegetation that the gnatcatcher needs to nest has disappeared. And finally, another example I wanted to highlight is the red-legged frog. Some of you may have read about the actions that have been taken. The Santa Monica Mountains has been doing a project to restore red-legged frogs to some of the streams in their region, and they had a great head-starting program going on, releasing red-legged frogs, and then they had massive fire. And what comes after massive fire is often erosion. The first rains come and sedimentation just piles into the creek, and the whole creek gets filled. Well, if you're an aquatic species or you're an amphibian with your eggs in that water, that can be a death knell. And there was an effort, I think, recently, and I believe the NAT staff, Brad Hollingsworth and colleagues, were part of that with USGS, to go and get some additional red-legged frog eggs from populations south of the border and see if they could get some of those populations going up here to infuse our populations that are at risk. But I've been talking a lot about this, I mentioned that we've got the wind-driven and the fuel-driven, and I've been talking a lot about how we see change in this landscape with the with the wind-driven fires, but we also have seen the fuel-driven fires here. As I mentioned, that happened during the Cedar Fire. This photo at the top is from the 2013 Chariot Fire. And there's a whole different circumstance that's going on. This is the other part of our backcountry. It's not the dominant vegetation, it's not the dominant issue, but it plays a really important part of San Diego's biodiversity. And if I show this map again, the areas that I didn't focus so much on, the yellows to the greens, are areas where we have less frequent fire. So it seems maybe confusing or conflicting to have areas that are burning too much and areas that are burning not enough. But all of these are problems for us that we need to address in San Diego, and it just makes for much more complicated land management. But you'll see these areas that are green that are not burning frequently enough happen to be our mountains. Here's Laguna Mountain. Oops, you can't see my mouse. Here we go. Here's Laguna Mountain, and we've got Palomar Mountain, San Jacinto, San Bernardino, San Gabriel. All of those areas, those are all our montane regions, and they're not burning frequently enough. And in fact, if you look to a recent paper that was put out by Forest Service scientists, you can see that this graph the colors at the top here represent time since fire. And you can see a lot of it in those forested areas are red. And that means it's been 80 to 100 years since fire in many of those places. We've got some areas in the green, but not quite enough. And if you look at it in a different way, lost my mouse again. Here we go. If you look at it in a different way, we've got the 4 different national forests, Cleveland, San Bernardino, Angeles, and then the Los Padres south and north on this graph here. You'll see that the percent of area that has burned only once or twice, it's the vast majority of area in these forested landscapes across those different national forests. Only the Los Padres has burned more frequently than that since 1908. Now that's a really long time. Now, it might seem like that's okay because I was just talking about chaparral, like the normal interval is something like 30 or 50 or 100 years. So what is it for forested landscapes? Well, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to work with some colleagues from UC Berkeley that I'd worked with on the Fire surrogate study. See, all the pieces connect here. It just keeps sucking me back in. And they came down and did some really cool work on what's called Fire Scar dendrochronology. And that's really what this picture here shows is you take a slice of a tree, of a conifer tree, and you look at the rings and you can see different scars. So you can see in this example, they've identified where those scars are. And if you get enough samples, you can sort of correlate across the landscape and figure out what the time since fire the time in between fires has been. So in this image here, each of these lines is a different tree that's been sampled. I helped the researchers sample from Palomar Mountain, which is FC, Fry Creek, Cuyamaca in the center here, and then at the bottom, Mount Laguna. And you see we got a decent number of trees, some of which were very old, dating back to the 1600s, which was really awesome to see. And once we get to about the mid to late 1700s, we're able to have enough samples from a tree that we can actually assemble that fire history. And you can see what's down at the bottom, very bottom here, is lines that show the frequency at which we normally see fire. And you can see there's a whole lot of these lines until we get to about 1950, and they start to peter out. And that's about when we started taking on the approach of full fire suppression. So any fire that started, the goal was to put it out as soon as possible. But it wasn't really in keeping with what we think that the fire history should be, with the fire frequency. It was really anywhere between 5 to 10 to 13 years. It was fairly frequent, relatively small fires was what we had experienced. And we just stretched that out. And it has had ecological and fire risk consequences for the region. And this is exactly what we're seeing across Northern California as well in many parts of the West. This wasn't just a one-off strategy. This was taken across the West for fire management. And what can happen is what you see in this picture. This is a picture from 2003 from Palomar Mountain, where we had loads of dead trees to deal with and no place to put them. So we had to take on a project to cut a bunch of these dead trees down. There was too much standing dead from the drought. And what had happened was we suppressed fire for so long and the canopy shaded over, and we had trees that were able to grow under that shaded canopy, and they just got very thick. It's white fir and cedar trees that are able to grow under that canopy. And it became so thick that once we had a drought condition, they didn't have the available water that they needed, and trees started dying. So now we have this very dense and partially dead forest to deal with. And we had to undertake this large project to pull these trees off. And please don't think that this was a logging project. If you look at these trees on this landing where the bark has come off, there were conchs, there were fungi growing on these trees. They were so dead. We almost couldn't find a way to get rid of them because there was so much material. And this was just a real challenge of how do we deal with this? And it has implications for the spotted owls that should be living here, or some of the cool species like the mountain king snake that you would expect to see if we have all this deadened down material, or if we have fire come in and burn through this. Imagine how much hotter it would rip with all that dead material. And we, through my time with the Forest Service, we were busy dealing with these issues. I spent time working on prescribed fires to improve forest health, that a number of thinning projects to get that understory cleared out so that if fire did come, it didn't get into the canopies of the trees. It stayed on the ground and cleared up the ground fuels, cleared up what we call ladder fuels that get into the canopy and make the fire much bigger. It helps us just manage that fuel on a more regular basis. And we also did a lot of projects in our chaparral working with communities to try and help protect communities through a variety of approaches. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But I spent all that time working for the Forest Service, but I had finished my PhD and I just had a lot of visions about other things I wanted to do. And so I turned my attention back to connectivity. And I had spent some time working on it and developing a climate connectivity plan that would help us be more strategic about our investments in conservation. But then I sat back after I'd finished that project and I looked around and I said, I'm preaching to the choir by serving this up to folks who already believe that conservation is something we need to be doing. And how can we have greater impact? How can that work be more meaningful? How can we bring more people into the fold to understand that there's a benefit of connectivity, of protecting natural spaces, of protecting biodiversity? And I think the way is to think about the other things that people are concerned about. Everybody has their own different perspective and set of values, and that's okay. But we have to be able to speak to those people and articulate how one type of action like conservation can benefit communities, their well-being, how we can use strategic planning to mitigate fire risk, how our natural spaces filter and protect the water that we so desperately depend on down here in Southern California. So how could we put all these pieces together in a much more interdisciplinary fashion? We often spend time planning for each of these things in isolation. And I really wanted to try and bring the pieces together so that we could do more. We could think about these benefits all together. We could talk more as a community, both about how we protect our wildlands, our ecological communities, as well as our human communities, because too often we treat them separately as human communities are bad for ecological communities. But the truth of the matter is we are inextricably linked. We are here, we do affect those ecological communities, and there has to be a better way to be thinking about climate adaptation and managing these interconnected systems. And so with that, we took on the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project, and you may have heard about this. We spent quite a bit of time working with people across our communities in Southern California to get the word out about this and to learn from people about what kind of information and data they need. And the idea here is really to be planning for climate-ready landscapes, to think about how conservation can benefit our communities and our wildlands. And you can see, as I mentioned, we've sort of got these three main components. We're focused on fire, we're focused on water, we're focused on biodiversity, but not just in isolation. We want to put the pieces together, as you see sort of towards the bottom of the screen. And the idea here is to work with, across the top at the arch here, you see a lot of the different types of communities we're trying to deliver this messaging and the data and science to. It's about being more strategic in all the different types of work that we do. Thinking about what the multiple benefits are of protecting both our wildlands and our human communities and thinking about them together. And really one of the most important places where we've been focusing our energy is in planning integration, thinking about how local jurisdictions plan, how maybe some of them are involved in conservation, but maybe not all of them are. And they are making decisions about land use, about fire risk, about water management, and how can having a more complete picture help be more strategic. Now, as you can see, we have a whole separate fire team, and I want to acknowledge them all now. Many are at San Diego State: Doug Stowe, Emmanuel Story, Krista West, doing fantastic research. If you know anything about fire in San Diego, you know about Alexandra Seifert. She's an amazing researcher. She's been with the Conservation Biology Institute for a number of years. She's now working with an underwriting company to use her vast knowledge of fire and fire ecology to help inform decisions about fire and fire management. And then finally, my colleague, Erin Conlisk, who's with Point Blue Conservation Science. And they've been working on some really fantastic products, data to inform planning and management, thinking about where do we have vulnerability to drought that we need to be planning for that might create areas of fire risk or experience ecological degradation. And so they've been developing data on that front. Where do we see herbaceous cover change? I keep talking about that vegetation type conversion where we see a change from shrublands to grasslands. How can we identify where those areas are now as soon as possible and do work to maybe restore or prevent further ignitions in those areas to help prevent the negative ecological consequences of that change, but also to tie it back to thinking about fire risk. As I mentioned, grasses are lighter, flashier fuels that can contribute to fire risk for our communities. So these pieces are inextricably linked, and we want to treat them as such. And just thinking about things like looking at where fires are and how we're recovering from fires. So if you're looking at this, you're probably thinking, this sounds a lot like it's focused on the wind-driven fire parts of our system, our shrublands, and it is. But never fear, we have more work coming because we just don't stop, and this just seems to be a big stone that's rolling down the hill, and all the pieces are coming together, and it's just so fantastic. So I can't get away from the Forest Service. I keep coming back for more, and was able to connect with colleagues who saw the issue of what's going on in our forests and have identified a really strong need for a group to come together to develop a climate-informed conservation strategy for how we manage these forests. And this is really about building collaboration, a foundation of knowledge that everyone can work from, people coming from different management perspectives and backgrounds, to really establish a community of practice. And so the great thing is that the Forest Service will be leading this work because they are the manager of a lot of the forested lands in Southern California, and they're funded by the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. But they've brought us on, myself from San Diego State University, as well as my colleagues from the Climate Science Alliance, because we've just spent so much time working on these strong stakeholder connections, this really meaningful approach to working with communities, asking what people need to know, making sure that we're listening, making sure that we're delivering data in a way that can really help make decisions, that can influence the way that we go about doing things, by making sure science is at the forefront, by making sure that the data are there to support the decisions that we're making. So we're really excited. We're just kicking this project off now. We haven't even had a meeting yet. We'll be doing that in December. If you're interested in this, stay tuned, because the community will be a part of this as well. But I'm just really excited to have the opportunity to use all that time and experience I spent working on forest health and forest management for the Forest Service to bring it back and connect to these other aspects of research that I've focused on. And really the idea behind this is to make sure that we're thinking about protecting the values that come out of our forests. Our forests provide a lot of services. It's all about sort of articulating those benefits I was talking about before, things like carbon sequestration and wildlife habitat and corridors, and protecting watershed, the aesthetic and spiritual connections. Our forests are very important for our local tribal communities, indigenous people who, those were their ancestral lands. They still are, but they're now managed by a different agency, and making sure they have an opportunity to help protect the land that they were stewards of for time immemorial. And it's also very important for recreational opportunities, right? What is everybody doing this pandemic, aside from feeling cooped up? Our one opportunity to get out there is to experience nature. And I think we've seen a surge in that. And hopefully that increases the appreciation. But these forests are at risk. We've seen rapid warming, persistent long-term droughts. I talked about the impacts of that on our own mountains here. We've seen variable precipitation and pollution, but really the fire issue is a big one as well as invasive species. The gold-spotted oak borer has decimated a lot of our native oak population. And we probably need to undertake restoration to bring those populations back, so we actually have good, strong, healthy oak populations in the future. And so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to work on turning these thicker, more dense forests into something that's, this one just makes me cringe because I think about what it's like to be out here. You know, it took over 100 years to make this problem, and we're not going to fix it overnight. But, you know, there are a lot of tools we have at our disposal. There's no quick fixes, but collaboration is really going to be the best way that we move forward on doing better with protecting and conserving our montane forests. And it's a key part of assembling this whole comprehensive strategy. As you can see from what I'm talking about, these are all separate projects because it's really hard to tackle everything in San Diego. We're so diverse, our ecological communities, our species, just having the communities that we have, it makes it complex, but it makes it really interesting and exciting. It certainly keeps me moving and keeps me interested. There's always something more to do, and I feel so privileged to have the opportunity to be able to work on this, and in particular work on it with such great colleagues who want to move forward and do great work. So, you know, hopefully with this strategy, we'll have more opportunities for making the forest healthier, restoring burning. As I mentioned, also, hopefully restoring some of the cultural practices of burning. You can see the deer grass here. That's a culturally important species for our local tribal communities. Kumeyaay, Cupeño, Luiseño, Cahuilla. These are all really, the forests were very important and still are to their culture and identity, and making sure that they have an opportunity to be part of the conservation solution and conservation conversation, because it's not just about ecology, it's about culture and life and identity. So making sure that perhaps cultural burning is part of, and you may have heard about this, other parts of the state, this is a big part of our conversation about how do we restore forest health in this state. And part of it is by looking to the folks who were stewards of this land for many, many centuries, and to learn what they have to say about how we do that. So that hopefully we can bring back fire to the landscape safely and have more resilient forests. So before I end, I just wanted to touch on a few things, because you can't have a fire talk without sort of thinking about, well, what can we do, and how are, you know, we're at the center of this. We people are at the center of this. What can we do? And what can we do to protect wildlands and communities? Well, in wind-dominated fuel systems or fire systems like our chaparral and shrubland systems, we address it with the 5 Ps, which John Keeley and Alex Seifert came up with. And it's really about people, prevention, planning, protection, and prediction. It's about trying to avoid these impacts in the first place, trying to avoid more starts, trying to be strategic in our land use planning, trying to limit the number of fires that we see on the landscape. In contrast, in our fuel-dominated systems, we want to think about this by addressing the need to restore forest health. And that's going to come, you know, it got this way after a long period of time, but it's going to take some pretty intensive action to put things back in a more natural state. So that's going to be fuels treatments, understory thinning, probably prescribed fire. You know, you saw some examples of things I was talking about earlier. And I think it's just really important to mention that we are at the heart of this problem. We do not have natural ignitions in this part of the world very often. Lightning is a little bit of it, as you see on this graph, but by and large, it's equipment and power lines. And you'll see this is area burned in black, and gray is the number of fires. But you can see not very many fires with power lines, but you know, when the winds start blowing, the power lines start moving and arcing. You know, SDG&E has done a fantastic job of trying to predict wind and turn off power to limit fire starts, and have been really proactive. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, and it can spread really fast. And the equipment, you know, we can do better. There's more that we can do to limit those starts. And you may be thinking, well, what can you, an individual, do? And I think one of the first things is thinking about reducing ignitions. Where do they come from? I used to sit at a desk in the Forest Service next to a radio base station, and I could hear beep, 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 vegetation fire. And then they would come out, and it would turn out it would be somebody using a weed whacker on a red flag day, because they panicked. And they used a metal bladed weed whacker, and they struck a rock and ignited a fire. Being proactive about doing clearance and not waiting until the red flag event comes is a great way to start. Supporting fire safe planning, making sure that your community plans are thinking about fire safety and making land use decisions that don't put more homes in the path of fire. Protecting homes, working from the structure out. And I just wanted to share this great graphic from Alex Seifert and John Keeley, where here we are on the right-hand side in Southern California, and you'll notice that there's 3 things that really made the difference. This study was about what factors determined whether a structure burned or not. And the 3 ones that were most common in Southern California were if they had done work to protect eaves, to protect vent screens, and window panes. Structures were less likely to have burned. Well, what does that really mean? Let's see here. There we go. It means that we have to think about pathways for embers first and foremost. The reason that those components of the structure are so important is that when the wind is blowing and the fire is going, embers are flying, and you don't have to be anywhere near that fire for a structure to burn. So really thinking about that when you're working on fire safety at your home. It's also important to think about creating defensible space. So in other words, that 100-foot clearance that's required by the county for firefighter safety. I'm married to a firefighter or a former firefighter, so it's important to think about those people. I worked with them for many years. And, defensible space doesn't mean clearing down to bare mineral soil or, planting ice plant that has resource implications. It's not good for our ecological communities. It could just mean green vegetation. It can mean picking safer plants that aren't as fire prone. So, there are ways to do this to protect your home and to protect firefighters, but to do it in a way that we consider biodiversity and natural resources in our fire protection measures. And that's really a lot of the work I did for the Forest Service was walking that tightrope, thinking about that very careful balance between fire risk and safety and protecting the rich biodiversity and natural resources we have here in San Diego. Because we just have such a rich place that we are fortunate enough to experience. And it's worth protecting, and it's complex, but it's not impossible. And hopefully with the research that we're doing, it'll help make it easier because we'll have plans and we'll have science behind us. So with that, I have a couple of websites to share. I hope that you visit them. If you have interest in any of the projects I've been talking about, I'm happy to field questions via email, but I look forward to taking your questions. Hopefully you've typed some into the Q&A box.
Well, thank you very much, Megan. That was a fascinating talk and chock full of information.